scientific-minded than me, so perhaps you can help me understand something that happened the other day. I was driving to the church, and I was on Clinton River Road over towards Cass Avenue, and there's a pond off on the right that has a fountain. And as I approached it, I was really like, wow, you can really see the colors of the rainbow, from the mist of the pond. But then as I lifted my polarized glasses, I could no longer see it. Joe Bilecki, you could probably give me a 30-minute explanation of why that happens. I'm assuming it's something to do with the polarized glasses, why I could see it or not. But I was thinking about that, and I was like, wow, Lord, that's kind of cool. Without the glasses on, I wouldn't have noticed it. I would have drove by that fountain like I do most of the time if I come that way, and never thought anything of it. And as we dive into John this morning, we're actually going to go through the passage in a sense twice, because I want to look at it in two different sets of lenses. Just like when I was looking at that fountain and the spray, I got a different picture of the beauty that was there through a different set of lenses. As we look at John, in this passage we're in the tail end of 18 going into 19. We're going to look at it a couple different ways to try to get some more of the beauty of what John has tried to capture in this passage. So we're going to start in John 18. If you want to turn with me, we'll start in verse 28. Now, we covered these last few verses last week, but we're going to hit them again because they kind of all tie together as we look at this time that Jesus was before Pilate. Now, for our first lens that we're going to look through this morning, we're going to do our traditional look, and we're going to walk through it chronologically and pick it apart and see the little nuances and things that John has shared, and then we're going to take a step back and look at the larger literary unit that John was working here. So starting in verse 28, it tells us that they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Now, so the Jews, they had a rule that they were not supposed to enter into a Gentile's home. And so as we go to the governor's headquarters, Pilate would have had quite the setup here. Most likely, most scholars believe the place he was at, he would have had his home there, so he has all of his stuff. He had an area that he could sit on a judgment seat and judge. There would have been barracks for his soldiers. And so there's all kinds of stuff there, and there would have been this outer courtyard. And this is where the Jews come into the outer courtyard, but they know that the law says if they go in, they'll be defiled, and they wouldn't be able to eat Passover. Now, to clarify some timeline issues here, John's account seems to point to Passover already being underway, but there was a feast that started at the end of Passover and went on for a week. So these guys are like, listen, I don't want to mess it up. I don't want to be ceremonially unclean. Now, an interesting note about that. These Jews are worried about being ceremonially unclean, but if we look at the other gospel accounts, we know that they purposely produced false witnesses at Jesus' trial before the high priest. And they are bringing before Pilate a man that they know that they have done wrong and sinned. And it really reminded me in Matthew's gospel when he was just ranting on them, he said, you blind guides straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. And we can really quickly kind of put these Jewish leaders in a box and say, well, they were just they were part of God's plan and they were fulfilling prophecy. But we can be just as guilty. Sometimes we can get on these little pet things that we like, I am going to stand hard on this one truth from Scripture, and we will have major sin in another area. And so the guys are hanging outside, they won't go in. So this creates this interesting in and out, which will come into play as we look at the second filter here in a little bit. So it says Pilate went outside to them, and we talked about this last week. He said, what accusation do you bring against this man? He's a little bit snotty, like, what are you doing here? What did this guy do this time? And they answered him simply, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. And so you see they're already in a tension with Pilate. Now it is interesting, though, right off the bat, they're not directly telling Pilate the root issue. Because honestly, they know if they tell him he's claimed to be God, Pilate doesn't care. And so they come up with something else. Well, if he wasn't doing anything bad, we wouldn't even have brought it to him. They're not even bringing up the topic yet of what is going on. So Pilate says to them, Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. And so Pilate knows, like, listen, if this is just something between you, take care of it. This isn't my problem. And the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Now, I want you to get the kind of how ludicrous this scene is. They are there saying, listen, we can't put him to death. But they haven't even said what he's done. So picture a trial lawyer going into trial and saying, listen, I'm calling for, do we have the capital punishment in Michigan? I'm not sure. No? Okay. In Ohio, we do. I've worked death row when I worked at the prison. And so picture in Ohio, a trial lawyer's going in, I'm calling for the death penalty, but he hasn't even presented his opening arguments of what he's done. That's how ludicrous this really is. And it says this is to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. And so they come before him, and so Pilate, though, he hears them, and then he goes on inside. It says he enters his headquarters again, he calls Jesus, and he says to him, are you the king of the Jews? And so right there, we know that Pilate's got some inside information. Now, some scholars think that the high priest and Pilate were kind of working together and probably part of some larger political misappropriation of funds and those sort of things that happens in politics. That never happens, right? And they're probably in together in cahoots, and so we see this, that maybe that's happened somehow or another. Pilate already knows kind of what's going on, and so he asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered him, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it about me? I love the way Jesus will turn a question, and he'll give it a question and an answer, because he's probing at the heart of Pilate, and he's asking, are you curious? Do you want to follow, or is it others? And then Pilate kind of gives him a snotty remark. He says, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? And so Pilate just wants to know. He wants to know what is going on. He's asking the accused, all right, from your side, what's going on that they brought you before me? And then Jesus gives him kind of a curveball answer. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. Now, we talked about that last week and just how powerful of a truth that is. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting. Now, it's interesting, the word for servants there, this is not a lowly servant. Maybe a better translation would be my statesman would be fighting. Jesus is talking in royal language here. As he's communicating to Pilate, Pilate would have caught this. He's saying, listen, my statesmen, my high up officials would be fighting for me, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world. And then Pilate said to him, so you are a king. And you see, Pilate's catching something here because Jesus is talking like a king. In the midst of being bound and chained, Jesus is addressing this official from a place of authority, from a place that he is not really under anyone's control. And Jesus answers, you say that, wow, that's a southern drawl right there. You say that I am a king. That's your word you would use. But he goes on to say, for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. And last week we talked about the kingdom of God as the kingdom of truth. Everyone who is of the truth, listen to my voice. And Pilate says to him, what is truth? In some ways, even as I looked at this again this week, I think some of what Pilate was saying, kingdom of truth? Good luck in this world. Because let's be honest, truth it doesn't get you anywhere sometimes in this world. People don't value that I'd say like they used to, but here we have Pilate saying, what is truth? Truth doesn't really matter. It's about influence and your political angle or manipulation a lot of times. And so it's, what is truth? And after this, he had said this, he went back outside. So you see Pilate going back out. He goes to the Jews, and he tells them, I find no guilt in him. Now, over the years, even when I was growing up, I heard a lot of teaching about Pilate's role in this whole ordeal. And if we look at the gospel accounts, some would lend towards more guilt on Pilate's part. But you catch his first response here in John's account is, I find no guilt in him. He's saying, listen, he hasn't done anything that deserves even my attention. Then he goes on, and it seems to be that Pilate's looking for an out to release him. Now, the other gospel accounts tell us the people asked for this. But he says, you have a custom that I should release one man for you at Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? And so we know from the other gospel accounts, he's kind of put it before him. He said, listen, I've got this tradition. You brought this guy before me. Apparently, there's really nothing he's done other than just a personal squabble. How about we just settle this now? I release Jesus, and it's all good. And they cried out, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. That word, the ESV doesn't translate that well. Insurrectionist in the NIV would be closer. Barabbas had led a rebellion against the Romans. He had murdered. Our best equivalent today, this man's a terrorist. To the Romans, he's a terrorist. And they are demanding his release over Jesus. Now, right away, we start to see the depth of their hatred that's stirred in their hearts towards the King of Kings. That they'll say, we'll take a terrorist and a murderer over him because we don't like what he says. And so we start to see the depth of their depravity. It tells us, starting in chapter 19, then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Now, we need to back up. I think I titled this The Most Unfair Trial. Pilate has declared, I believe this man to be innocent, and then he turns around and has him punished. Now, the Romans, they had developed killing people, they had developed torture into an art. And most scholars will attest that there were actually 3 levels of flogging that a person could get. The first level was kind of the lighter one, where they would beat him with rods and whips and leave visible scars that would be there for the rest of their lives, so that as you went through the rest of your life and you did, at least lived, you would have these visible reminders on you of what happens if you oppose Rome. Now, levels 2 and 3, they stepped it up a bit, where the whips, they would now add shards of metal and bone and rock, and they would try to just, rip into the person. And level 3, many people didn't survive. Level 3, the point they were trying to get was to rip the flesh off and actually do damage to the bones underneath. Level 3 was pre-crucifixion stuff. And so, as we look at this, there is an issue of the harmony of the Gospels. As we look at the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they seem to talk about Jesus being flogged after this trial. And here John mentions it before the trial's done. Different scholars vary in their opinions. My guess is, at this point, Jesus gets the lighter flogging. And when he is done with the trial, that Pilate gives him the pre-crucifixion flogging. And sometimes these guys, for the crucifixion, they would be flogged and they would die, and they would still nail their bodies up to the cross, and they would line these crosses along the road, and they put an inscription above with what they did, so that when you're walking into town and you read that, you think, if I do that, that could be me. And so they had it down to an art. And so they have him flogged. And if that's not enough, it tells us that the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. I have my crown that Wendy and I made for Good Friday this year. And actually, the thorns on my crown are small. One of the bushes that scholars believe they use, some of the thorns could be like 12 inches. And so they would have pressed this down onto his head. These thorns would have dug in. Have any of you ever been cut or hit up here? You know the blood that comes? When I was little, my brother and I got this bright idea that we would play baseball where the ball was a water stream and the bat was a cane. My brother was batting, and for those of you who have ever noticed my scar right here, that's what happens. Water and swinging doesn't, he knocked me head over heels 22 stitches later. And I remember the look on my mom's face when I went running into the house, because by the time I got to the house, I had blood down the whole front of me. And I think she turned whiter than I was. This would have been pressed down. It's a sensitive area up here. And so they would have pressed it down, and it says that they put it on his head and they arrayed him in a purple robe. This could have been a tapestry. It might have been a rug. We don't know. It may not even have been truly purple, because that was kind of a hard color to come by. It may have resembled it. And they came up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They're mocking him at this point, and they struck him with their hands. So Pilate, after this, he would have stood watch. That was part of his job. He would have been standing there watching them do their thing. And this is normal for them. They're used to this sort of brutality. And he went out again to them and said, "See, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." I think at this point, Pilate is looking for a way to release Jesus. And so he has him beaten severely by our standards, even though it was probably the lighter level initially. And he brings him out and says, "Here, listen, I beat him against my free will. I find no guilt. Know that I find no guilt in him." And so Jesus comes out wearing the crown of thorns and a purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man. Here he is. This is your handiwork." Now, lest we get too hard on the Jews, I would remind you that everything you've ever done that is against the nature of God that we call sin, there's your handiwork. Behold the man. When the chief priests and officers saw him, instead of compassion and pity, which I think was what Pilate was going for, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." Right here, again, Pilate's trying to pass the buck. He's saying, "Listen, you know what? I know you can't do it. You take care of it. I'm not going to do it." I think the conversation earlier with Jesus has stirred something in Pilate, that he knows that he's dealing with something beyond a normal human. And so we see him appears by the text, trying to release Jesus. And the Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God." And here, finally, so far into this, they tell the truth. We don't like him because he says he's the Son of God. Verse 8 tells us something interesting. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. More afraid. That seems to indicate that Pilate has got some fear stirring in his heart as he walks through this. And he hears this and hears this guy that's talked to him from a place of authority that seems to speak like a king. And they're saying, "Our problem is he says he's the Son of God." Now, Rome, they didn't necessarily believe in the one true God, but they had many gods that they believed in. So Pilate might be thinking in his heart, this dude might be a son of a god. And so it says that he's even more afraid. And so he goes back inside into his headquarters, and he said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" He's wanting to know. And I think his question was, are you from this earth or from above? Something has challenged the heart of Pilate. And Jesus, though, he gives him no answer. He just stands there. So Pilate says to him, "You will not speak to me?" Now here we see Pilate maybe stepping back, and understandably, this is a man in authority. He has command of all these soldiers, possibly this regiment of 1,000. He's a man in charge, and here he has a prisoner that won't even speak to him. And he says, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" And on a human level, Pilate did. It was his discretion. Capital offenses did not go before any sort of regular judge or magistrate. This is Pilate's job. And he does have the authority to say, no, he's free, and he has the authority to say, crucify him. And Jesus answers him this way. He says, "You have no authority over me." at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. This passage strikes straight at the heart of, I think, one of the topics that we really struggle the most with, and that is the sovereignty of God. We prayed earlier thinking about multiple hurricanes. And I don't know about you, I've already been asked by people around me, why? Why does God allow this? And I unfortunately, if you've been the recipient of this, I apologize for the Christians that are out there that are on a rant that God is bringing his righteous wrath. The Bible tells us that he lets it rain on the good and the evil. There are believers down there. We have CMA churches in Florida under this barrage right now. But Jesus brings up this topic. He's telling him this. He says, listen, in matters on this earth, you have no authority unless it's been given to you. You have no real power. The authority and the power structure rests in God. He is sovereign. He is in control. And Pilate, this isn't about you. It's not even your show. Now, as we get confronted by that, I think we struggle with that as we look at the events and, well, why does God allow these things? And why does God allow some of the atrocities? When we went to Thailand and we saw little girls, 3 and 4 years old, that are being raped by 80-year-old men because their families sold them into this sex slavery. You know, it welled up in me. I was angry. And we think, God, why do you let this? And I want to question the sovereignty of God. But I would submit to you that a God who is sovereign and in control is the best option. Another pastor that I listened to said it this way: if we reject that there's a God, and we say there is no God, then we have to accept that the consequences of that is this: that everything, that little girl that gets raped, to people who are getting their homes flooded even this morning, has no purpose, there's no meaning behind it, it just happens. That's a horrible place to be. People suffering for no reason. Some people would submit that the God he is all powerful, but he doesn't intervene. He just sits back and watches. Well, that's awful too, because that means there's still no purpose behind stuff. He just lets stuff happen, and he could help but doesn't. So doesn't that make him kind of a cruel God? Some people would say that the God is really powerless to do anything. People believe in this God that doesn't really have the power to fix anything. He's unable to overcome evil. He isn't big enough to help. Well, that kind of makes him a pitiful God. And then we have the God of the Scripture that tells us very clearly that he has a plan and a purpose for everything. Psalm 135:6 tells us, whatever the Lord pleases, he does. In heaven and on earth, in the seas and all deeps. The God of the universe is sovereign, and he does what he pleases. And so some of it is that as we face situations like this, we need to realize he can do what he wants. He is the God who created everything. In Isaiah 46:9 and 10, it tells us, remember the formal things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God. Now, for him to be saying this, I think he's speaking to Israel, saying, listen, you have forgotten what it means that I am God. I am God, there's none like me. Declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purposes. All my purpose. God has declared from the beginning the end. And so that would seem to say that from the beginning, God has declared even today. It's not just a foreknowledge, it would seem to indicate a controlling matter that he is sovereign and he has ordained this. And so the real question when we're faced with the sovereignty of God and all that He is what do you do with it? Do you sit and shake your fist at God and say, why are you letting this? Or do you submit to His leadership and you say, what would you have me do in it? And so one of the things I came away from Thailand was I had a burden that we're taking a group from here back. Right now we have a team of 8. There's actually one vacant spot. If you've been like, I really would like to go still, we have one spot open for that Thailand trip. But one of the things that God laid on my heart is I want to take people back and I want to lay that burden on others so that maybe you will do something more. And we're going to go help. What do we do in it? He will accomplish His purposes. Daniel 4:35 says, all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. He does according to His will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. This verse is very clear that God does as He pleases. He is sovereign in the heavens. He is sovereign in your daily affairs. And none can stay His hand or say to Him, what have you done? Finally, in Job 42:2, Job, at the end of being humbled by God, says, I know that you can do all things, and no purpose of yours can be thwarted. In the midst, for Jesus' disciples, of probably the most excruciating times of their lives, in the midst of the King of Kings being beaten and scourged, God's plans and purposes move forward because He is sovereign. Moving on, it tells us from then on, Pilate sought to release Him. Do you catch that? I think it sunk in what Jesus said. He sought to release Him. This is an ongoing thing. He's trying to figure out a way to release Jesus. But the Jews cried out. They had one last thing. It's their trump card. They knew if all else fails, we will get Him with this. And they say, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Now, Caesar Tiberius was notoriously cruel, ruthless, and crazy suspicious of everyone. He didn't trust anyone. And so if you thought someone was not loyal, they went away. He would have them killed, maybe severely flogged, but he was known for killing people that were not loyal to him. And in his little inner circle, there was this group called the Friends of Caesar. And to get in that group, you kind of had to be like ultra loyal. You had to do something really good, maybe in some nobility in your birth would help. And so there's no evidence that Pilate was a part of that, but any leader would want to be a part of that inner circle, to be called a friend of Caesar. And so basically they're saying, listen, if you kill him, you are a friend of Caesar, and you're getting rid of, you're offing a king that's come against him. But if you don't, maybe he'll find out, and you die. And so they break out their trump card. This shakes Pilate enough. And so when he heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat down in the judgment seat at a place called the Stove of Payment, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. And it says, now is the day of preparation of Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. Now I feel like this is a little bit of a dig at this point. Pilate's saying, listen, you know what? You pushed my buttons. Behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate says to him, shall I crucify your king? Now he's putting it on them. We know in the other accounts that he washes his hands, and he says, I wash my hands of this matter. And the chief priests answered, now catch how depraved they've become. We have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Now, in the Old Testament, there are some very clear passages that talk about God as king. When Israel was calling for a king in 1 Samuel 8:7, and Samuel was lamenting over this and feeling rejected, the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for I have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." The way God set up Israel, he was to be their only king. And in their zeal to be right no matter what, these Jewish leaders declare openly with their mouths, "We have no king but this earthly king Caesar." And in a sense, they declare a truth deeper than they even understand. They say that the God-man in front of them, who was the true king, he's not our king. And so their own words tell the truth about them. We have no king but Caesar. They would put themselves at the mercy of one of the most ruthless men in power just because Jesus said he was who he was. Now, I said I wanted to look at this through a second set of lenses. And so I think one set of lenses, we see the sovereignty of God at work as we see Jesus purposely walking towards it. And I told you, mentioned last week, this passage, this section of John seems to be a bit of a chiasm. And a chiasm is a form of poetry where we have sections that mirror each other. The beginning mirrors the end, and the next section mirrors the next section. And so if we would look at this in 18:28 through 32, and then in chapter 19, we see kind of these similarities where it was early, it was late. It was Passover and Passover. The Jewish leaders couldn't put a man to death, and in the other passage, the Jewish crowds called for his death. One mentions the type of Jesus' death, the other says crucifixion. You see they're mirrored with each other there. And if we had moved one section in this passage we just covered, again, it tells us in 18:33 through 38, talks about Pilate doesn't speak on his own accord, and then we just read how Jesus says Pilate's power is not his own. We also see in the earlier part, Jesus' origins, not of this world. And in 19:9 through 11, he's asking Jesus, "Where are you from?" You see the parallels that come. And when we do that, in 38 through 40, we have this Pilate finding no crime, and the same thing in 19:4 through 8, and Pilate bringing Jesus out in both places. So we see these parallels. And when you look at a chiasm, the key is that all of the phrases work together till you get to the middle section, and that middle section is the point, the main thrust. And when we get to that in this passage, we have Jesus flogged and him struck, he's crowned and hailed as king, and Jesus in a royal robe. I think John wrote it this way for this. The lens he wants you to catch in this is in this moment, our king is being crowned the true king. That in the midst of all of, it seems like humans are getting their way, this crowd that is turning from God is getting their way, John is saying this is his coronation. This is his crowning moment. Because at this moment, he drank the cup that belonged to all of us. And he won our hearts. He conquered us in our sin. He defeated us in our rebellion. And now, this is his moment where he's king. So I think John wrote this that way so we would catch this lens. This is about Jesus, his kingship. He's hailed as king. So what do we do with this? My challenge, first of all, is to recognize that God is sovereign. And what are you going to do with that? Do you reject it? Do you rail against it? Do you even deny his existence? Or do you submit to it and be used in it? And the second part I would challenge you is don't miss that in every horrible circumstance, in all of God's purposes, I think this section could spell out for the rest of our lives. It will always be, it ever always was about Jesus and his kingship. Now, do I know how 2 hurricanes in 1 week hitting the States. How that plays to my kingship, I have no idea. But he does. And so in the midst of this, I would submit to you that he is sovereign and he is good and he is still king. Even when we don't understand. Just like these people didn't understand, we don't get the bigger picture. Let's pray.